Hi, I'm Katherine Kott, Dr. Katherine Kott, longtime student of Bowen Theory and a retired organization development consultant. I wrote my dissertation on Bowen Theory and organization development. I'm here with Dr. Laura Havstad and Dr. Patrick Stinson to talk to them about tools they've developed to support both research and practice in Bowen Theory. Dr. Laura Havstad is a psychologist and the director of programs in Bowen Theory. She created a video that demonstrates the use of the family diagram app that Dr. Patrick Stinson developed. He's a psychologist and student in the postgraduate program at the Bowen Center. In the video, Dr. Havstad referred to a model she developed for doing family research in Bowen Theory, and I was curious about the work Dr. Havstad and Dr. Stinson had done and how the model and the app have informed each other. I thought other people might also be curious, so let's see what we can find out. Let's start with asking each person to give a brief synopsis of their work. If you could start, Dr. Havstad, talking about your model, and then we'll give Patrick a chance to talk about his app. And then for each of you, it would be great if you could let the viewer know where they could go to get more information.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kott. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk about the Havstad model and the app. The Havstad model got that name because Dr. Stinson put it into the app under that name. I had developed the model, the Havstad model, and called it the Framework for Clinical Research based on Bowen Theory. And it emerged out of research that I actually did back in graduate school and picked up again later on. And what it is a framework by which a clinician in clinical practice can organize observations of the family system and the emotional process, particularly in terms of the interdependence between the functioning of the family emotional system and the individual functioning of family members. And in that research in which the model was developed, I found that there were just several that I could organize the many different variables of Bowen Theory into several very basic variables that might make it easier for people to organize the complexity and detail of emotional systems. So the model is also applicable, and I guess you could say scalable, I think, to large scale clinical research, which was what I was doing when the framework emerged. And the variables of the framework are basically related to what I've called the basic clinical hypothesis of Bowen Theory, which is that individual symptoms, clinical symptoms, whether they're physical, emotional, behavioral, what have you, change in response to changes in the family system. This was one of the original observations, or maybe you could say the most basic clinical observation of Bowen Theory. So that if you could track shifts in the family system and shifts in the family members' individual functioning, in terms of the most basic variables that are defined in theory, which are level of differentiation of self and level of anxiety. If you could track these, you could actually see how the family system operates in terms of its relationship to the way individuals develop symptoms and the way symptoms operate over the course of time, whether they get better, whether they get worse, whether they resolve altogether, and whether they emerge again. So let's see, yeah, maybe I'll just kind of stop there. There's a lot more I could say. Let me just put in the answer to the one question you asked about where people could sort of look to read about the development of the model. There's a paper that I wrote with Kathy Sheffield. Dr. Kathy Sheffield is a marriage and family therapist who has a background as a nutritionist, and she helped me in that original research, and the article is published in the spring 2018 volume of the journal Family Systems, which is published at the Bowen Center. And the article is, what's it called? A Study of Weight Loss as a Model for Clinical Research, and tracking shifts in the family system and changes in symptoms. So
great. Yeah, that's a really very helpful introduction, and we will have a chance to talk a little bit more about the model and how it fits with the app, and you can fill in a little more detail kind of as we continue the conversation. But now we'll go to Dr. Stinson and have him talk a little bit about the development of his app.
Well, the app project started out pretty simply as just from an impulse, more or less, when I was in the beginning of grad school, grad school in my doctorate for clinical psychology. You know, I'm getting into clinical training and being primarily, or you might say, I guess, exclusively interested in Bowen theory, to what extent that's possible, and wanting to produce family diagrams for family assessment and for clinical work, just like anyone would who has that interest. And you know, it could be a generational thing. It could be because I'm a computer programmer, but the very first time that I sat down to put together a family diagram about a real case, I realized, or I had this sort of impulse that said, oh no, you know, if I want to add a cousin or something like that, I have to redo the whole diagram, because because of the fact that you might not have space to add in a subgroup, for example. And I just have this, I don't know if it's a rigid fixation or if it's just a principle that I've developed as a computer programmer, to not repeat yourself. The acronym is actually DRY, D-R-Y, do not repeat yourself. And that doesn't mean don't repeat yourself. It means don't build something over and over and over again when you could potentially separate it out into pieces, so that when you have to change one part, you just change the one part while the rest of it can stay the same. It's like a modularization type of thing. And so that's kind of built in, and I thought, man, you know, if this well, first of all, I saw the diagram as a model kind of from the beginning, I guess, a data model. It's like, this is a model of the family. It's something that you would add to and refine through time, you know, through various clinical sessions, for example. And if you're going to do that, and you want to be able to focus on the accuracy of the data and what you're adding in at each incremental phase of refinement, then it would be a lot more efficient to do that if you're not worried about, or if you're not caught up in rebuilding the whole thing every time. So this is where my software brain is going. So I thought, well, you know, the second I started that first diagram, I thought, oh wait, there's no program to do this. There's no program even to draw a diagram efficiently that is at least, well, there are a few, but I didn't like them. And I thought they were not very efficient, and they were certainly not organized around Bowen theory and differentiation of self. So I thought, well, I should make an app to do this. And that was all that went into the beginning motivation or vision for the app. And so I started doing that. That seemed like it would be a contribution in itself. But then actually Dr. Havstad had this idea that came up in the seminar for programs in Bowen theory that I met both of you in, that I was a part of at that time. And she said, wouldn't it be great if you could track emotional process through time? And that idea, I would say, is what it was, the beginning or the germination of my thinking that led to what the app has become. And I mean, it's not just my thinking, but all of the thinking that I've done to and put into it being what it has become and where I hope it will go came from that idea. And so that would be a change from just drawing a diagram like you can do on PowerPoint to really not even, it's not a big change from the idea of refining a model of the family. I mean, that really is the fundamental idea, but it's doing it a lot better in the sense that now you can do that a lot better if you're also tracking data chronologically, not just in terms of, for example, birth dates on the diagram and ages on a 2D surface, if you will, but on a chronological timeline that is consistent with the diagram, in the sense that when you jump to a spot on the timeline, it updates the diagram to match. So just that idea changes, that idea in combination with the idea of it being a constantly refined model or representation of what the family is, those two combined changed the trajectory of the app project into a clinical tool, yes. But also to something that has more of an integral role in research. I wanted to say family research, but it's you know, research into something similar to what the Havstad model or the framework for research in Bowen theory would asks. The research question that I think comes from the clinical hypothesis of Bowen theory, to use the term that Dr. Havstad used, which is, what is the relationship between all of this data you can collect, let's say like in an EHR, an electronic health record, which is kind of what the app is moving toward, I think, in the long run. What is the relationship between all of this data that you can collect for, say, multiple individuals over time, and the expression of any one symptom in any individual? Or maybe you just simplify that and say, in one individual, the client who's in front of you, or something like that. So I think that's probably a good description of the evolution of it, but it's but the point being that, just to describe what the app is, or the vision for the app, what the app ideally would be, is that there's two parts to it. There's that it would help the basic clinical process of assessing a family, and provide a way to not lose any of the data that you're collecting, to constantly be adding and updating or refining, correcting observations about the family, and then to build on that data collection towards research into family, into the behavioral variable on physiological symptoms, for example, and to reach toward a data model that would scale. That means a data model that would organize the collection of information for that kind of research, that would scale to many applications of that research question. And familydiagram.com, I think, is the easiest way to get information on the app.
Great, and that's where the video is too, that I mentioned earlier, that Dr. Havstad made, describing her use of the app. And actually, Dr. Stinson, you anticipated some of the next level of questions I was going to ask you about using the app in clinical practice and for research. So maybe I'll go back to Dr. Havstad now and ask her to talk a little bit about the video and how you used the app. And you mentioned in the video that the dynamic nature of the app, which is really one of its strongest features, as Dr. Stinson mentioned, allowed you to see things that you hadn't noticed before. So maybe you can talk about that a little bit and how that relates to your model, whether your experience of the app triggered you to think about changes to your model, what the relationship between your use of the app and your model might have been, or might be, continue to be.
Well, well, I guess in terms of what Catherine's, maybe the main question you asked me is about how using the app with the model might have affected what I was able to see and what I was able to learn.
Right.
Which I talk a little bit about in the video. And so there were several things. Maybe I'll just sort of enumerate that for whatever reason, it really ended up really clarifying my understanding and view of the difference between chronic and acute anxiety. So that was one thing, and that had to do with, so the framework says that the clinical framework for research in Bowen theory says that changes in anxiety moderate and symptomatic activity in practically all kinds of symptoms. And I think modern research, particularly in the area of stress, has really validated this aspect of Bowen theory, that there's a role of stress in almost every clinical phenomenon that's been studied. But in Bowen theory, there's two kinds of anxiety. One is chronic and the other is acute. And so acute anxiety refers to sort of events, transient things that one can address, things that happen. There's you're running out of money and you better go to work. You're sick and you better go to the doctor. Something like that's going on. Chronic anxiety, what really became clear to me, so this is maybe a more general point about the effort of really trying to take one interview and put everything that happened that was described or was observed in that one interview into the app. This is a family evaluation interview that looked at the history of a symptom, like one would do with a patient who is coming to see you for the first time. So trying to get everything entered into the app makes you think about everything and forces you to not skip over things. Now, I think it doesn't force you to do this. This was just the task I set myself, to somehow put everything that was of importance in there. And so in doing that, in trying to, so shifts in the level of anxiety of a patient or, someone that you're coaching or studying, or yourself, changes in levels of anxiety could be changes in chronic anxiety or changes in acute anxiety. And what came really clear to me in my thinking about changes in chronic anxiety, that really relates to durable shifts in the relationship patterns in which individuals are observed. And that is the origin of chronic anxiety, because these patterns in the family operate over and over and over again. And in the relatively rare event where a basic pattern shifts in a durable way, chronic anxiety shifts in a durable way. That's very different than acute anxiety that goes up and down all the time. And it's really the shift in chronic anxiety that reflects a shift in the change in a relationship that I believe relates to changes in clinical symptoms that are also durable. So, not that this was exactly something that was unknown, it's written in theory, but something about seeing that in the app really, really helped me distinguish that. So that's one example, and I think it's just an instance of what happens when you have a system like the app provides, along with the model and the variables that you're tracking, to be very, very carefully observant. I think that the app has the potential to really train us all to be much more reliable observers of emotional process. I think I'll just stop with that.
Yeah, that's really great. And so what really happened for you is that using the app kind of validated the model, at least as far as it really showed you very clearly the importance of addressing chronic anxiety in creating a shift in the emotional process.
Yes, I would say that the app was a vehicle for me to test the model again, which I've done in numerous other ways.
Mm-hmm.
But also in finding that it was a good match that way, that I could apply the model in the app. It also helped me refine observations, the one about anxiety being an example. Mm-hmm. I can give another example about triangles, but maybe we want to, I don't know, move on.
Well, I think that would be good. I did have one other question related to the use of the app in research kind of more broadly. I think you mentioned, Dr. Stinson, that you're looking at the app as a way to aggregate data. Am I getting the terminology right?
That's my word for it.
Yeah. I mean, that's how I would talk about it too, from my ancient history background as a librarian. But I'm curious what that looks like in terms of, for example, validating the model, for example, or really thinking about how aggregating data kind of reinforces Bowen theory concepts, if I'm understanding what the purpose of aggregating the data would be.
Well, that idea first came to me a couple of years ago, actually, while I was listening to the question and answer period, the final one, in one of the symposia at the Bowen Center. And I made a comment about it then. It was one of these conversations about artificial intelligence, and I was just starting to learn about machine learning, which is all the rage right now, for better or worse. I mean, in kind of the most complicated answer, I could say that, something like machine learning requires a large data set. It requires a defined data set, well-defined data set, like what the variables are, and how, and quality of the variables, how well the data match the variables, and then you basically stick a machine on it, and then the machine, if you're doing an unsupervised machine learning situation, which is more inductive, it tries to tell you what the patterns are in there.
Mm-hmm.
All that to say, I mean, there's some jargon in there, but really it's just the basic scientific principle that you want a representative sample of whatever it is you're studying. You need large enough sample sizes to have sufficient statistical power to make useful predictions on whatever it is you're trying to use to guide your decisions. And if you're, and so all, you know, those ideas are well known enough. The problem is, what does a data set look like for the family emotional system? You know, the family emotional system being a concept defined in Bowen Theory, emotional system rather. And so how is it that you study something systematically? How do you systematically build a data set that captures what it is that you're trying to study in that system? And the problem is that, at least this is the way that I've conceptualized it, using more modern scientific terminology, I think, is that the family is a complex system. It has multiple feedback loops that are operating at the same time on each other. And in the case of a family, that would be the functional levels of, at least the functional levels of the individuals in the family, you know, the attention of the individuals in the family, where they're devoting energy. All these types of things are happening in the relationships between individuals simultaneously, to the point where you get chaotic or complex systems type behaviors. So how do you study that? You know, what are the variables that you need to start recording so that across enough families to have a large enough sample of families to be able to just see what patterns emerge? And then seeing what patterns emerge is the step where machine learning would come in and just sort of help with that. Whereas the traditional method would just be where, you know, you have a human observer with a smaller sample set, like 20, 16, 5, you know, just to kind of do just to eyeball it, if you will, see what just appears as a pattern. But, you know, the power of this all came together in my mind thinking, you know, okay, machine learning is more or less a fad, but a fad that's producing a lot of useful discoveries, because it can take aggregated data sets or large sample size data sets with many variables and pick out more complicated relationships between the variables than a human can. And, you know, whereas a human might be able to put together 1 or 2 or 3 variables at most, there's actually a little bit of research on this kind of thing, to try to define some kind of a predictive relationship. And a machine learning model could put together and or define relationships between, theoretically, an unlimited number of variables, although it's possible to dilute the research with too many. But anyway, that was a long-winded way to say that, you know, if an objective, inductive research effort at seeing what is predictable in the family system in terms of how it modulates the functioning, and so also, I guess, the resilience or adaptive capacity of individuals in it. If that's going to occur, that kind of research is going to occur, you've got to have a systematically collected data set. And that's where I have been slowly moving toward landing on this framework with these 4 variables that Dr. Havstad's put together, which has, I would say at this point, very greatly influenced the way that I define the basic research principles, regardless of whether you like those variables or not. But it has impacted the way that I would define the basic principles of this kind of systems research or emotional systems research, a complex living system, as the unit of study. And that has so also had a significant impact on the way the app is designed. I think it's designed around those principles more than anything.
Great. So Dr. Havstad, maybe you want to respond to what Dr. Stinson has just talked about, or maybe you want to integrate your other example about triangles in your response. Up to you.
Well, let's see, what's the, I suppose I was just maybe wanting to elaborate a little bit more on the framework, which I believe is robust and sturdy and inclusive for including all data that is relevant, and organizes it in a way that enables an observer, a researcher, a clinician, somebody studying their own family, studying their own functioning in their own family, allows observation. It gives cues as to where one focuses one's attention without getting too lost in the weeds. You sort of, you know, and exploits, I think it exploits our tendency to react to shifts in our own functioning and in the relationships. So I think we find this level of the family system is not obvious and clear and in the forefront of our thinking. We tend to be cause and effect thinkers, but we're reacting to it all the time. So I think the idea of observing shifts in 4 basic variables is within the realm of making it easy enough ultimately for people to be able to input data of what turns out to be incredibly various details. So I'll just say again that the variables are changes in relationships. And in the app, this right now is defined in terms of the basic patterns that Bowen defined: conflict, distance, reciprocity, projection, plus cutoff. And the triangles come in with a couple of symbols that Dr. Stinson experimented with, whether people move towards or away from one another. And those symbols I actually ended up using an awful lot in inputting the data from this particular case that I put in and demonstrated in the app, and found that what was emerging was a picture of the triangles, the way the tension is moving between people in a pattern where some members of the family come together around leaving someone with the emotional load, and how that moves and changes. And I was, you know, able to actually observe that in a visual dynamic diagram of it, which was just a little bit revelatory. You kind of know this is going on, but triangles get so complex, we can't conceptualize them. But to be able to input information into a digital application that then can produce a visual is just, I think, a very interesting step forward for being able to observe systems, emotional systems. Did I get at your question?
Yes, yes, just a very exciting thing to see, to have kind of made manifest in the dynamism of the app. That's it's a really good example. And whether or not the machine learning vision that Dr. Stinson has comes to fruition, it's just already an exciting and amazing tool for people to use in clinical practice, and also just in the work that people might be doing in their own families. So I don't know, now I really just like to open it up for the two of you to maybe have a little bit of a dialogue at this point. Some things that might have come up for you that you've thought about as each of you talked about your part in it.
Yeah, I have one. And that was something that came up as Dr. Havstad was just talking. It seems to me like one elusive aspect of at least my vision for the tool, or what I'm reaching toward, that is hard to get across and also hard for myself to stick to when I use it, which I think probably speaks to its importance, is the aspect or the goal of challenging assumptions about an understanding about the phenomenon in question. If that's a family, challenging assumptions about how this family adapts to stress, for example. And it seems like there's two modes you can get into, and I actually kind of spoke to it before, and I'm really speaking more to just how people work and how people approach these complex problems, I think, than the app. But it seems like you can get into a mode where where you're just trying to communicate or trying to reinforce or trying to clarify existing assumptions. Not that that's a bad thing, but if you're sitting down with a PowerPoint presentation, I'm sure there's an analog to this in a research model, when you're using a research model. But if you're trying to put together a diagram and you're drawing it out on paper, you've got a PowerPoint presentation and you're basically illustrating what's already in your mind, then that would be a distinct operation from systematically tracking what is factual and using that factual information to challenge your existing assumptions about what it is you're describing. The latter, I suppose, would be more similar or synonymous with research. And it's one of the most interesting things about applying Bowen theory in clinical practice is challenging assumptions about what's happening in the case. So, the research attitude in the case. And so, I mean, the goal, it seems like a goal would be for the development of something like both the framework and the app would be how is it that you can how is it that you can organize the available facts to be able to see something you haven't seen before, or to see something you've been looking at for a long time in a new way? Because that just seems like a major barrier to solving these complex problems, like a behavioral health problem or a chronic health problem or something like that. So I had some other thoughts about the framework, but I don't know what you think about that, Dr. Havstad.
Well, I think, yeah, absolutely. That, I mean, the whole idea of say research is that you develop systematic methods that that result in not skipping observations that don't fit into what one's biases or preconceptions are. And in that way, maybe any good research project challenges is structured in order to be able to challenge the hypothesis, thus the null hypothesis, that one has either got a good guess or an inaccurate guess about what's going on. So it has been, I think, terribly difficult to develop ways of structuring a system of observation for the complex system that is the family system. I don't know if this is the case in other areas of systems biology, whether it's so difficult. I know in observing human behavior, we are just much more subjective than we are when we're observing other systems that are more removed, other biological or physical symptoms and even systems. And those, of course, we know in the history of science have, taken decades and centuries to become increasingly accurate in our observations about it. So this is what we're trying to do, in our own lives and in scientific knowledge about the human and what goes right and what goes wrong, in order that we can apply that knowledge for a better life for people. So I do think, the app, along with the framework, I'll be interested to see. I mean, I think the basic structure of what's in the app, you add a few variables that you want to track, and sort of the basic variables of the relationship system are there. And that what people have to do when they're attempting to learn about the functioning of their family or about some research families, is they have to construct some kind of data sample and then construct rules for including all data, something like that, not being able to skip anything. So in the example of the clinical subject that I did the video about, it was a case example that I've reviewed many times over the years, and in reviewing it by putting it into the app, I realized I had made an assumption about one event. It was a move that seemed insignificant to me because it was not a major geographical move, but it resulted in a shift in the relationship in terms of the level of contact between relatives. And that change in the level of contact produced reactivity. And that was a critical step in what happened that eventually led to symptom remission in one of these individuals. Now, that was something I'd skipped over in my thinking. And the fact that it was in my data set and I had set out the goal of putting everything in there, regardless of whether I thought it was significant or insignificant or not, produced an observation that I had not made before in all the numerous times I'd been over the data of this particular interview.
To me, one of the most exciting things about both the model and the app is that it gets people who are interested in Bowen theory out of this conundrum that was present in the Bowen network for as long as I've been studying Bowen theory, which is more than 20 years, that it's too complex to do anything with. And it's just so exciting to see sort of that taken up as a challenge, and both of these tools moving forward to the point where it's sort of out of a position of helplessness, right, that we like to talk about, and into a different sort of a different path in being able to understand better Bowen theory and kind of test the assumptions present in the theory. So it's really exciting to see.
I do want to say, you know, with respect to the app itself and the goal that Dr. Stinson has for it being a site of aggregating data that I do think it's shaping up as a tool for aggregating data on family systems that really will enable us to study the family as a system. This is not, well, I don't know. I mean, I guess, Patrick, how far do we have to go with this, would you say?
You mean how far do we have to go yet until that goal is realized?
Yeah. Yeah.
If I knew that, I'd probably start planning financially a little differently than I am now. But I guess maybe one way to answer that or to speculate about that would be, what are the important milestones along the way to reach the goal? I have some idea, or I have some suspicions about that. First of all, well, I've thought about this for a while now. First of all, like I was saying, you have to have, I think you have to have a consensus, or at least, I guess it would be automatically a consent. You would need a data model that's well-defined and accepted. And I'm only saying accepted. Obviously, it has to be well-defined because you need quality data if you're going to produce any kind of a research result that has predictive power. And I'm saying accepted because I think, and this is more of a suspicion, but I'm sticking to it. I think that a research effort like this would require a lot of data, a big sample size. Not in the beginning. You know, it seems like there can be an exploratory phase to just define some of the concepts. I mean, we're in that now. I say we, meaning there is an overlap between this framework and this app that is, it does seem to, in trying to see how they relate and in continuing to dialogue about that and all the, you know, tensions and conceptual conflicts that go with that, the concepts themselves are getting refined, I think. Like, for example, there was this discovery, I'm getting a little sidetracked here, but this is so interesting. There was a discovery that happened, I think, in conversation with you, Dr. Havstad, and me about, oh, there's a relationship variable in the framework. And that is simply saying that there was a change somewhere in the relationship system. And then it occurred to one of us that the symbols on the diagram are the variable R. And that's the same thing. You know, it's a shift in the relationship system, which affects the pathways of anxiety and that kind of thing. So anyway, so this is obviously an exploratory phase. This is an early phase, and there can be some of that. But eventually there has to be a data set or a data model that is clear enough, valid enough, but at least clear enough, and accepted enough to have data coming in from lots of different angles, lots of different people. The crowdsourcing is a popular term for that. That was the initial idea I had for the app, was that if you can get it in the hands of clinicians and you can keep the data anonymous enough, or they agree to, you know, upload certain cases or something, you could start crowdsourcing a data set. These days, I'm thinking more about finding a data stream that's already there or something, but now I'm getting really speculative. Anyway, I think that the data model has to be defined. It has to be defined in a way so that it can be fed by large sample sizes accurate to that data model. you know, and then you need either a lot of people or a few smart machines to start seeing what patterns emerge in the data. That's the simple pipeline. And I don't know how much time is between now and then, but it seems like at this stage, the hardest part is defining these variables, defining the data set. And that's what this conversation has been a lot about, I think. And even before that is the principles of research that the datas are based on, you know, which is really covered, which is what a lot of what Bowen wrote about, for example, Dr. Bowen wrote about, and what his students have written about, I think. For example, defining a theory on facts alone and not refining the theory based on your, based on which observations you want to ignore, you know, refining it on the observations that are there, this kind of stuff. Which gives me a chance to throw in a side note that one of the interesting things that I think about the framework, and that did shape my thinking in the way that I've designed the app so far, is that it does also allow you to track facts, complex facts, in that so to join it together with everything else I just said, this is an aspect of the data model, that those variables allow you to track shifts, just shifts, just that there was a change in anxiety, that there was a change in the symptom, that there was a change in a functional level, that there was a change in a relationship system, but not trying to quantify them so much and get into that kind of thing yet, at least. Because that allows you to track facts. Did the anxiety go up or not? You know, and you can maybe get into a debate about whether or not that's a subjective observation in some cases, but in a lot of cases it's not. It's pretty obvious. Anyway, I kind of got sidetracked a couple times there, but that's a good question. Where is it going? But I have no doubt that it's going to get there. That is a subjective impression, but I am optimistic, probably from my background in software, that data will emerge, and it's a matter of being able to see it and see the applicability in data that is meant for something else, and say, hey, wait a second, the variables, all the information for the variables that are described in Bowen theory are there, and it's a matter of organizing it and feeding it into this thing that is emerging between this tool that's emerging between the app and the framework in the right way. And I don't know where that's going to come from, but we are collecting so much data. We, being humans, are collecting so much data on so many aspects of human functioning, I think, without even realizing it right now, that I'm just optimistic.
So that's one path to aggregating a large amount of data, and then sort of on the smaller side would be encouraging people, and I hope this video will actually encourage people to get involved and use both the model and the app to test them and give each of you feedback on what they're learning from the process. And that's at a different level. That's a much smaller scale level, it seems to me.
Yeah, and if I can, I want to add something with that, is that, I mean, that was the initial idea, at least, was for most of this to be clinician based. You know, I just gave a description of a vision that's very broad and goes far outside of the clinical context. But you know, it seems like, well, so far, for the people that have gotten serious about documenting cases, there have been unsolicited reports almost across the board. Well, across the board from everyone who's reported to me. And I'm talking 20 people. That there is some kind of at least a psychological effect, which of course has its interaction with emotion. But there is some effect in the level of objectivity that comes out of just trying to do what Dr. Havstad was talking about, which is include all of the relevant data in the app and get it in there. Usually there's an impression of how the data should be recorded that is more subjective and has more to do with an impression. Like, I want to show, or my understanding of this app, of this family, is that the basic pattern is conflict, and then, you know, it shifts with projection and this kind of thing. And there's a relationship there. But it's a different thing to document the facts that support that impression, and that just getting specific about dates at least, and then what the fact was that happened. Converting an impression into a functional fact. Like saying, oh, my view of my daughter changed on this date when she said X. It's a fact that she said it. It's a fact that the view changed. You could say that, although maybe not getting into the details of what the view is. These kinds of things, and converting those into functional facts so that they can fit into the timeline, hopefully in relation to some variable, but not necessarily. That process has some kind of an effect on what is seen in the family. It's a positive effect on the level of objectivity. And I think that that was apparent in what Dr. Havstad was talking about in the case that she was working on. So anyway.
Great. So I'd like to hear from you again, Laura, before we wind it up, which we should probably do in the next few minutes. So do you have anything to add or response to what Patrick has just been talking about?
Well, I would just like to say that so far, I think there's just tremendous validity to Bowen theory, having worked with it so much over time. And that one of my interests in developing the framework for clinical research, the Havstad model, was to sort of provide something that was conceptually workable, simple enough to be applied to clinical research across medicine, psychology, because I think the world doesn't understand the family system variable. I mean, we who've studied it a long time understand a lot about it, but I think there's a lot more to learn. But the world at large has not really in a significant way begun to think about the way in which all kinds of human outcomes are affected by relationship systems. Or if they have begun to think about it, they don't have a very good way of thinking about it. And I do think at the level of individual clinical symptoms, whether they're physical illnesses or emotional disorders, whatever, what have you, that the basic variables of the model of the framework for clinical research, and that is changes in relationship system and changes which impact the level of functioning and the distribution of anxiety, the level of anxiety a person has, that within the family, that is such a basic source of variation in adaptive functioning or resilience, as Patrick was saying, that that operates in the physiology of people and is one of the essential variables in symptom development in the course of symptoms of all kinds. That one of my interests was really in seeing this viewpoint brought into mainstream clinical research, where it can be tested and validated, changed. Maybe it's not the case. I have nothing more but increasing confidence that it is the case. And I would like to see that emerge in mainstream clinical research.
Great, great. Well, I think that's a good note to end on, and I'd like to thank both of you for your time and for sharing your thoughts with me and with a wider audience. And I think I certainly learned a lot, and I hope those people who are able to watch the video will also. So thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.